All right, folks, just a little bit of context before we start. This is episode 4 out of 5 with Andy Lubershane, partner at Energy Impact Partners, where we explore fusion-level bets. In other words, technologies that could completely reshape how we think about energy on this planet. In today's episode, we are going deep underground and we will talk about geologic hydrogen and geothermal. Enough about me talking, let's see what's happening underground with Andy Lubershane from Energy Impact Partners. All right, we're back. Today we're going underground for geologic hydrogen and geothermal. Let's start with geologic hydrogen. But before that, I'd love a bit of a history of hydrogen, because, if you've been around climate tech for the last decade, I would say, at some point, hydrogen was the perfect solution to everything that was ever possible to imagine when we think about energy. But then all of a sudden, it felt like a lot of people kind of backed off from hydrogen. Can you tell me more? What happened?
Hydrogen has been through two hype cycles, the most recent one being a very big peak in expectations in the past, 20, 25 years since I've been paying attention to energy issues. In fact, back in around 2006, 2007, I read a book called The Hydrogen Economy, and I was actually I was kind of bought in for a little while. And, it's one of those things that the climate tech world got very, very excited about during the big spike in enthusiasm for, net zero commitments and trying sort of every possible opportunity under the climate tech domain that you could find around 2020 to 2022. And has really backed off since then. I'm proud to say that I was probably on the bearish end of the spectrum, even during that wave of enthusiasm. And, the way I've sort of thought about it is the reason that hydrogen tends to get so much excitement is that it's sometimes thought of as sort of a Swiss Army knife as an energy carrier. And the reason I think about it as an energy carrier most of the time is because the primary wave of excitement around hydrogen is usually around what we call green hydrogen or electrolytic hydrogen, which is basically taking clean electricity, usually from renewables would be the idea, and using it to split water through a process called electrolysis into hydrogen and oxygen, which leaves hydrogen gas as effectively an energy carrier. And then with that hydrogen gas, you can store it in tanks or underground. You can put it in pipelines. You could liquefy it or compress it to move it over longer distances. And then you can burn it as a zero carbon fuel in theoretically all kinds of different processes and at different scales. And so that's the Swiss Army knife perspective on green hydrogen. The reason that I've always been more skeptical is because at the end of the day, if you're trying to do a job, like a Swiss Army knife could be a virtuous thing to have, but most of the time you actually don't want to use a Swiss Army knife, right? Like a Swiss Army knife is only useful if you don't have the actual tool for the job that you want. And I think about hydrogen in kind of the same way. In most sectors, you actually don't want hydrogen. You want something else. You want electricity. You want a denser fuel that's easier to transport. And I've actually written in a few times over the years that the best description of hydrogen I've ever heard as an energy carrier, as a fuel, is that it's a pain in the ass fuel. Like it's a pain in the ass molecule. Like hydrogen has all kinds of downsides as well. It's actually not very easy to store and transport. It's highly energy dense gravimetrically, because hydrogen is such a light element, but volumetrically, not so. And
just for that, I mean, I had to go back to that sentence a couple of times, but what you're saying is basically like it takes a whole lot of space to be able to store little amount of energy. although it's very light, but we don't care so much about the weight. Is that the correct way to think about it?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of space to store energy, even though not a lot of weight to store energy.
The weight is not really the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. In most cases, and then the process of splitting water, this process of electrolysis and compression of hydrogen, and all the ancillary equipment that's required, has turned out to be extremely expensive. And we actually have an investment in a hydrogen electrolysis technology company at EIP called Electric Hydrogen, which is about as on point as you can get. That I actually think has an approach that is the best way to bring the cost of electrolysis down. And there are places where hydrogen has a real role to play in the energy transition, by the way. I don't think it should be thought of as a Swiss Army knife that could be deployed across every sector. But there's one role that hydrogen absolutely has to play in the global economy, in the global energy economy, which is being hydrogen, because there are some there are some molecules in which no other element will do, and we we produce a tremendous amount of hydrogen in the world today via what's called gray hydrogen processes, usually by stripping hydrogen off of methane or natural gas, which is a carbon intensive process. But it's because we need that hydrogen as a feedstock for making ammonia, which is an important feedstock for fertilizer. For all kind of petrochemical refining processes, you need hydrogen. And actually today, like just the process of making hydrogen for those industrial processes is about 2 to 3% of all global primary energy consumption. Like a crazy amount of energy we use just to make hydrogen. And again, those are for the use cases in which you literally need hydrogen and nothing else will do. So just for decarbonizing those sectors, which are massive in and of themselves, I think it's worth it to invest in pathways to make hydrogen. But yes, I think the world has learned that it's a lot harder than we might have imagined or hoped during that wave of enthusiasm. And the applications, you need to be much more specific about the applications you're targeting rather than every end use for energy around the world.
And if we think about the need to decarbonize hydrogen, so obviously, as you said, there's a large market, 2 to 3% of energy use worldwide, so that's a very big market. What is a blocker? Why do you say that green hydrogen is not used as much as it should be today?
I mean, the blocker is really cost at the end of the day. If you're starting, and it's cost relative to the alternative, which I mentioned is reforming methane. So stripping the carbon off of CH4, you end up with CO2 and two hydrogen molecules. And the cost of doing that at scale in the US today is very low. Largely because the cost of natural gas is very low as a primary energy resource. So you're starting with a very low cost primary energy resources. You're using the energy in that gas as the energy to perform the reaction. You end up with, a cost of producing so-called gray hydrogen in the range of, $1 to $2 per kilogram of hydrogen, which is typically how it's priced. It's more expensive in Europe or in East Asia, where you're relying on liquefied natural gas instead of shale gas from like we have in the U.S. Today, a decently positive case, actually, like an optimistic case for green hydrogen in most scenarios is probably more around $6 a kilogram.
3 times as much.
Yes, more than 3 times as much in most cases in the U.S. Still twice as much as it is in Europe. And again, like that's when things go pretty well. I think it's possible to get the cost of green hydrogen lower using technology like electric hydrogens, but very, very hard, if not impossible, to compete with gray hydrogen without some sort of subsidy or cost of carbon.
And so how can we solve for that?
So there's this, I would say it's a long shot in the scheme of fusion level bets. I'd still call it a long shot, but it's one of those opportunities that kind of comes from left field, which is a totally different way of procuring or sourcing hydrogen, which is known as geologic hydrogen. And the basic idea here is that instead of trying to, strip hydrogen off of water, you're looking for natural hydrogen that occurs, that is found deep within the earth. Basically, you're drilling for hydrogen just like we drill for fossil fuel resources today. Now, a few years ago, I think almost everyone in the world had never heard of this concept of geologic hydrogen. And that's largely because hydrogen is a pain in the ass molecule, as I've said, like, especially compared with hydrocarbons, adding those carbon atoms really makes those molecules much easier to work with. And they're super abundant. So it's not like people were exploring, going looking for geologic hydrogen the way we've been exploring for fossil fuel for, 100 years now. Um, but as a few folks started to consider the value of hydrogen as part of a lower carbon economy, there was a handful of people out there that realized that there were a few places in the world where we already knew there was hydrogen naturally occurring underground and actually seeping up out of the ground. Um, and actually, one of the sort of telltale signs of that are, basically when hydrogen is seeping up out of the ground, it kills vegetation, and in some places would seep out in these kind of circular formations, which
Mhm.
may have been the basis for some of the sort of ancient stories about fairy rings. At least that's what I've heard. I don't know if that's a myth or not, but in any case, there are known locations where hydrogen naturally occurs, and so a handful of people a few years ago got the idea, let's go looking for more of those. And let's start drilling and seeing if we can extract hydrogen as a natural resource, just like we extract hydrocarbons today. And I'll say one of our one of my colleagues at the time, our former chief technology officer at Energy Impact Partners, Dr. Michael Weber, who's a professor at UT Austin and an all-around awesome dude. Um, he was one of those people that was privy to this opportunity, I think, before almost anyone else in the world. And so we were lucky, really lucky, to be aware of it before most, and to be able to invest in this company, Coloma, which is one of the first companies that has been drilling now for naturally occurring hydrogen. Coloma has some unique data assets that we think give them a real advantage in this area. But now they're not the only ones. There are, a couple dozen other companies that are exploring for this somewhat mythical resource, which would be potentially a game changer and extractable theoretically, depending on the concentrations we can find it in, at costs that are comparable to gray hydrogen.
And so, do I understand correctly that extracting hydrogen from the ground is quite an easy task, but the challenge is where to find it? Is that correct?
I wouldn't say it's an easy task, and I'm getting a little out over my own skis here. But we do know it's not a task like there's nothing impossible about it. It's an engineering challenge. Hydrogen has different properties than methane, which a gas we extract out of the ground today in large quantities, but it's something that's doable. We need to learn again about what concentrations we find it in, what other gases are in the mix, the right processes for extracting it. But those are, I won't say trivial, but they are surmountable problems very much, it seems like. And we have one of the advantages of doing anything in the subsurface when you're extracting molecules from the ground is we have a massive and extremely technically savvy industry today, which we can leverage. You're not starting from scratch when it comes to drilling holes in the ground and extracting gases from them. It's the question are really more around exploration and the scale of the global resource. And honestly, this is the biggest question for geologic hydrogen: is how big is it? it may be that it's this tiny niche. You can find a few places in the world where there's some deposits of naturally occurring hydrogen that are, you can extract at a good cost. And maybe you'd build an ammonia plant there to make use of that resource, or a petrochemical refining facility, or a pipeline to move that hydrogen to a nearby industrial cluster. But, it's not a globally relevant primary energy resource. But it may be. That's the thing. We just the only way to find out is to do more drilling and more exploration. And that's why it makes it one of the more exciting fusion level bets that's out there, and still one of the bigger question marks, because there's not like a path that we can take to know this for sure.
And before we get to the rating of geologic hydrogen, can you please share with me the numbers you have in the newsletter? Because I think the range of the numbers in terms of like the estimates of what could that deliver in terms of hydrogen are extremely funny to hear.
Yeah, so the U.S. Geological Survey did an assessment that they published in 2024. They were trying to model the total global geologic hydrogen resource. And the model, I mean, honestly, like the output is all over the map, which is a feature not of their assessment being bad, but of the level of uncertainty that exists right now. They basically modeled it somewhere between about 1 billion tons of resource, which would be roughly 10 years of supply for the hydrogen commodity market as it exists today, which again, I would call meaningful. That is a meaningful resource, but not really civilizationally relevant. At the high end, they estimate there's about 10 trillion tons of geologic hydrogen available, which would be enough energy to satisfy the entire world economy for thousands of years. So somewhere between not relevant to all of the energy we would ever need is the error bars on geologic hydrogen.
Quite interesting. Well, look, let's get to the rating of that technology before jumping into geothermal. So look, is geologic hydrogen a fusion level bet according to the index? Let's start with cost and affordability, which I think is going to be one of the funniest, by the way, rating that we have to do because we don't know much.
I mean, we're going to caveat, like the caveats for geologic hydrogen is always going to be in each of these ratings that we don't know. But if things work out well, even at $1 a kilogram, that's still not actually super attractive as an energy resource. It's very attractive as hydrogen. So I would say that's still like a 3 or a 4 from a primary energy cost standpoint.
From a safety point of view?
Presumably pretty good. Again, if they have the right processes in place for extraction, but yeah, it should be pretty safe, 8 or a 9, I would think.
All right. From an emissions point of view?
Very low, right? Almost no emissions. Incredible way to produce hydrogen if we can do it. So 9 or 10.
Apart from the supply chain, basically, it's nothing.
Yeah.
From a speeds perspective,
Lord knows. But again, if it's there, if the resource is in the ground, in the right places, the right concentrations, yada, yada, this is the great thing, again, about being underground. You could quickly turn the attention of our massive oil and gas industry. Even a fraction of the attention of the oil and gas industry turned to this resource would mean you could scale up very quickly. So 9.
And talking about scaling up, that's also the hilarious part, which is like we don't know the range really, but let's talk about scalability.
1 to 10. That's the one I demur. I can't possibly pick a number.
All right. Well, ranks pretty low in the mapping that we have so far. But look, that's not the only thing that's happening underground. There is something else underground, mostly about heat. That's interesting. So let's talk about geothermal. What's the idea and maybe just the technical basics of geothermal and how to produce energy from geothermal?
The idea is that there is heat energy available below the surface of the earth. It's actually originating from basically radioactive decay from minerals and metals within the earth, as well as heat that actually goes back to the origin of the planet. Also, gravity plays a role. But at the end of the day, we know that if you drill down deep enough, it starts to get hotter anywhere in the world that you go. And that heat is continuous. I mean, it's continuously emanating from the core of the Earth up through the crust. And so it is an infinite renewable resource, effectively, that we can tap into. One thing that's really important to point out is that anyone who's dug down with a shovel will realize that the heat is not available right below the surface of the Earth. You have to dig deeper. And basically, the deeper you dig, the more heat is available. The amount by which you have to dig down varies around the world based on all kinds of geologic activity. There are some parts of the world, there's some locations where, digging down 100 feet or so, you might accidentally discover a source of heat that is plentiful enough to make power. There are other places where you'd have to go several miles down. One thing we know for sure is that if you were able to get to, below 5 miles, certainly below 6 or 7 miles below the surface, you get to the point where you could probably access high quality heat in the range of 200 degrees Celsius or higher almost anywhere on the planet. So if you could drill consistently and cost effectively to those depths, then geothermal would be an extraordinary global energy resource.
And that's the interesting part for this discussion today, which is like we're already producing geothermal energy in the order of magnitude, which is like less than 1% of all of global power today, at least probably even 0.0%, like very, very low. But we're already producing energy both as a power generating kind of for electricity, but also as heat as well, which we can also use. But what's interesting about this discussion today is to have geothermal everywhere. Because as you mentioned already, if we can do that, we have basically limitless energy, 24/7, everywhere in the world. So it seems like a great technology to have, right? But if we want it to work, what are some of the elements that are required to be able to scale geothermal everywhere in the world?
Yeah, when you hear about the advantages of geothermal and then you look at how much is installed, there's a huge disconnect, right? Because globally speaking, there's about 9,000 gigawatts, 9 terawatts of power generation capacity. Of that, 16 gigawatts, that's 16 period, no zeros, are geothermal. So it's a tiny, tiny, insignificant global resource today. And that's because historically, we've really only been able to deploy geothermal power generation or any kind of geothermal energy supply in places where you accidentally find that heat rising very close to the surface of the Earth. In fact, I heard a fun fact once that half of the geothermal power that exists in the United States today, which is just a few gigawatts, was discovered by accident by people drilling for water, and they drilled down and hot water came out of the ground. They're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what we could do with that, right? Which again is a very limited resource. And so, if you're looking to deploy geothermal, you need to find high enough temperature heat, which generally means drilling lower. You also need to find something else. You need something else underground besides heat. You need permeability. So you need to be able to put some sort of working fluid down into the rocks below ground to capture that heat and have enough surface area such that you can capture that heat efficiently with the wells that you drill and then return that heat to the surface, which means you can't just have like this hard rock that you drill one well down into and pump some water. You're never going to get enough surface area to capture the heat energy. You need a permeable reservoir, and then you need water as well, right? You need or some other working fluid, some other way of capturing the heat. And so what we're doing today, like the most likely path to expanding geothermal capacity today is what's known as enhanced geothermal production. And usually what that entails is drilling a little bit deeper than we have historically, but more importantly, focusing on that permeability element and drilling in places where you have pretty good heat close to the Earth's surface, but instead of relying on finding naturally occurring permeability in water, you basically frack your way to a permeable reservoir in those locations. This is taking advantage of fracking technology that has now been, honed over 15 years or more in the oil and gas industry, and using it to create these geothermal wells. And this is what Fervo, which is the standard bearer in that enhanced geothermal space, is really famous for doing and has been pushing the boundaries of now.
And fracking basically means like crushing a rock. Is that what I understand correctly?
Correct. I mean, there's two primary things you're doing is drilling horizontally or diagonally. So instead of just one well straight down, you drill down, then you turn the drill bit, drill across, and then using pressure and fluid breaking up the rock, which creates this permeable reservoir, more surface area to touch the rock and extract heat. In the case of oil and gas, it's used to break up little pockets of hydrocarbons that are lodged in certain types of rock. In this case, it's really just to make more cracks and crevices within the rock to use as a reservoir.
Interesting. Well, look, you mentioned something that's quite interesting about the fact that we need to drill deep, because even for Fervo, they still need to drill very deep to get that heat. What are some of the challenges with that? Because I could imagine that, drilling, first of all, is not enough, right? Like we just can't just drill and, be happy with that. We have to do something with it. So what are some of the technical challenges that comes with like being quite deep on Earth?
Well, I would say to begin with, again, the oil and gas industry has gotten better at drilling deeper over time. And actually, I looked this up that the average well depth for oil and gas in the United States has more than doubled since around 2010, as this fracking revolution has really kicked off. It's, back around 2010, the average well depth was just about a mile. Now it's 2.5 miles actually, down below the surface. So what that means is that without any kind of radical revolutionary technology, companies like Fervo can drill down deep enough in some parts of the country, most likely, particularly the Western US, which is where all the geothermal is today, where you do have places where heat is more naturally available closer to the surface. And, hopefully get cost-effective geothermal deployed there. If you want to expand geothermal to other parts of the US, basically moving east, and certainly many other parts of the world that don't have the natural geologic activity of the West, the US West, that is, then you need to start drilling lower. And unfortunately, this is where the real fusion level technical challenges come into play. To make geothermal viable everywhere or anywhere, you would need to drill much deeper. And that, for someone who's not a geologist or an oil and gas kind of engineer, when I first heard that as the problem, I was like, you're kidding. We could have effectively a fusion level resource available anywhere in the world. All we need to do is drill deeper. Like, let's drill deeper. Come on, But it turns out that drilling deeper becomes exponentially harder and more expensive from a technical standpoint. The deepest hole that humans have ever drilled in the world, which took, I think well over a decade to drill, in part that's because it was drilled in Soviet Russia, but the Kola super deep borehole, it was 7.6 miles deep. That's the deepest we've ever drilled. And that was like a crazy, passion project. I don't even really know why it was done. As you drill down, it becomes much higher pressure. The temperature increases, which has implications for all the materials you need to use in the drill. Also, this sounds like a sort of a silly, surmountable problem, but it's really important. As you drill down, you're creating all this crushed rock, all this stuff, right? Like this, you have to extract the material that you're drilling. That's no easy challenge. And so it's possible to drill 5-6 miles down, in most parts of the world. We can do it. It's just a question of at what cost. And and how repeatable is that and scalable is that? And we're talking hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour for drilling wells down 5+ miles down for making geothermal energy. So
How
you
does
sort
that
of need
compare with solar, for example?
well, the cheapest solar in the world is $10 a megawatt hour in Saudi Arabia. Typically in the US, like good solar would be maybe $30, $40 a megawatt hour. So 10 times or more. So it's just, you need a paradigm change when it comes to drilling technology, if you're going to make geothermal anywhere viable as an energy resource.
It's quite interesting because during this mini series of episodes we're doing, comparing this with fusion, for example, is so fascinating because fusion, like, we don't know how to do it. Like, we're trying to learn. Geothermal, we know, but it's just like it's too expensive to do. So, like, every technology has its own problem, which I find fascinating. But you said we need a step change. Where does the step change comes from? Where is it possible that we find a step change?
Yeah, that's one that I don't know. I don't have like a very I have no prior view on what the right path is. There are a handful of companies that are trying to go super deep, using a variety of different technologies that are out there. Quaise is one of the standard bearers here in the U.S. I'm actually surprised there aren't more companies that have some wild-eyed idea for better drilling technology that can get you much deeper, much cheaper. Because I do think of this as comparable to fusion. In fact, if you were able to do it, if you're able to consistently, cheaply drill that deep, this would be better than fusion. There's no fuel, there's no radioactive waste whatsoever. Like the power generation system up at the surface is, an organic Rankine cycle, or if you get hot enough, a steam cycle turbine. There's nothing exotic about it necessarily. It should, we should be making the kind of civilizational bets into super deep geothermal that we are making into fusion. Part of the reason we're not is that, again, it's just so hard, and it's hard in ways that are non-intuitive. Fusion, the reason fusion is hard is it can be pretty intuitive once you start learning even the basics of fusion. You're like, oh, that's bonkers. Like I don't know how you could possibly achieve hundreds of millions of degrees and compress the plasma, et cetera. But again, like, it's not intuitive why drilling so deep is so difficult, but it is.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not intuitive, but still, like, if you remember your science classes from school, like, you can think about how much heat comes out of the center of the Earth, and it's like, yes, I could see why we have issues with like drilling so deep, because at some point it's like, what are the materials that we even going to put there that are able to drill and not just completely break, or like are
Yeah.
not just going to be like not usable anymore? Like
How do
some
you
of the
how do
stuff
you
are
have a 5 mile deep hole that doesn't just collapse in on itself at the bottom, right? With the pressure of the earth coming from 5 miles of depth. I mean, it's just, yeah, these are fusion level questions.
exactly. Well, that gets us to the last part of this episode, which is talking about, is geothermal everywhere a fusion level bet according to the fusion index? Like, um, let's start with cost and affordability. Do you think it's going to cost a lot of money to get there? It feels like it is, right?
I think it is, sadly. And that's really the question, but I don't think in most good scenarios geothermal is like a super attractive low cost energy resource. I'd say we can hope for a 5 on affordability, maybe 6.
Yeah. And you could see why. I mean, drilling just so deep on Earth, like, it takes a lot of money. Um, Talking about safety and security, actually have just like like my gut feeling is that there might be some problems with like drilling so deep, but I don't know where it comes from.
It's not my area of expertise. I don't know of anything we should be really worried about. Again, seismic concerns maybe, but like that's true of oil and gas drilling. And again, we're pretty darn good at that. So I'd give it an 8 on safety and security.
Let's talk emissions. It feels like that's going to be a really great grade.
Also very strong. Yeah, let's give it a 10. I mean, which is sort of the reason I picked these bets, right? And most of them are a 10 because they're selected for being low carbon.
Of course. Let's talk about speed of deployment.
This is a challenging one because just like geologic hydrogen, if you get to the point where geothermal becomes much more cost effective, you can marshal the resources and technical talent of the oil and gas industry and supply chain, which means you could see it scaling up very quickly. And in fact, I think there are going to be a lot of fast followers coming after Fervo. However, there is still in the meantime, like I don't see in the next 5 years us moving extremely quickly to like get to many gigawatts of geothermal. I see it as needing some time to ramp up before we could start deploying it, reliably pretty quickly. So
sense.
Let's give it a 5.
All right, and then scalability seems like it's very strong on that as well.
Yeah, again, the question is how deep can we drill affordably, and if we're playing the game of a fusion level geothermal technology, then it's going to be up to a 10 on scalability.
I mean, you're calling it geothermal everywhere, so
then yes, and it's a 10. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much again today, Andy, for that discussion. In the next episode, we are diving deep into energy carriers and storage, which is a critical part of this energy transition. If you're building or investing in climate and enjoy this episode, please give us a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or subscribe to the newsletter at the link in the description. Obviously, you should also subscribe to Andy's newsletter, Still for Fuel, link in the description. Amazing newsletter. I love it. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thanks, Hugo.